The mornings in Jordan's town always started the same. The sun rose slowly, its soft light casting long shadows across the narrow streets and modest homes. It was a town that seemed to pride itself on its ordinariness, a place where time moved deliberately, where the rhythm of life had settled into something predictable, almost comforting. Jordan Evans was a man who appreciated that rhythm. At 37, he had carved out a quiet existence for himself, running a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of town. Each day, he rose early, the hum of his alarm clock blending into the faint sound of birdsong outside his window. He would make a cup of coffee, black with no sugar, and sit at his small kitchen table, staring out at the world as it stirred to life. This routine was a refuge for Jordan, a buffer against the memories he tried not to let surface too often. He had lived another life once, a life of action, adrenaline, and danger, but that life had left scars, visible and invisible. Now, he preferred the steady challenge of fixing engines, where every problem had a solution, every broken part a replacement. It was predictable work, unlike the chaos that had once consumed his days. Jordan wasn't the kind of man who shared much about his past. The people in town knew him as the quiet mechanic who could fix anything with an engine. A man who kept to himself but was always polite. They didn't ask too many questions, and he didn't offer answers. This arrangement suited him just fine. Yet, for all its simplicity, life in this town wasn't without its undercurrents. The divisions here didn't shout, they whispered. They lingered in the small, subtle ways people interacted or didn't. Jordan felt it in the way conversations would shift when he walked into a room. The guarded smiles, the almost imperceptible stiffening of spines. He had long ago learned to navigate these moments. Not with defiance but with quiet endurance. It was just the way things were, and he had no illusions about changing them. On the other side of town, the police station stood as a symbol of authority, its stone facade weathered and imposing. Officer Ryan Harper was one of the most recognizable faces of that authority. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a reputation for being firm and by the book, Harper was the kind of officer people either respected or resented, depending on who they were and where they lived. Jordan had never had a direct run-in with Harper, but he had heard the stories. In a place like this, stories traveled fast. Harper was a name that came up often in the quiet conversations of Jordan's community. Some said he was a good cop, one who kept the peace. Others said his idea of peace often came at the expense of people who looked like Jordan. Jordan didn't know which version was true, and he didn't much care to find out. His strategy was simple: stay out of the way, keep his head down, and focus on the life he had built for himself. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was a peaceful one. Or at least, it had been. The days slipped by, one much like the next. The town went about its business, content in its routines, but beneath the surface, tensions simmered. It was an old story, one that never seemed to fully fade, no matter how much time passed. Jordan had learned to live with it, to find his own solace in the face of it. He had no desire to be a hero, no interest in standing out. But life has a way of disrupting even the most carefully constructed quiet. For Jordan, that disruption was coming, as inevitable as the sunrise. He didn't know it yet, but the life he had worked so hard to preserve was about to change. And when it did, it wouldn't be subtle, it would be loud, fiery, and impossible to ignore. For now, though, the morning stretched ahead of him, calm and unhurried. Jordan finished his coffee, rinsed out the cup, and grabbed his keys. There were cars to fix, engines to mend, and another day to get through. It was enough, or at least, he told himself it was. The road stretched ahead of Jordan, empty and quiet in the fading light of the evening. The hum of his truck's engine filled the cab, steady and low, a sound he had always found calming. Driving home after a long day at the garage was a ritual he cherished. These moments on the road felt like a pause between the demands of work and the quiet solitude of his small house at the edge of town. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a faint orange glow behind. The fields on either side of the road were shadows now, the edges of trees blurring into the darkening sky. Jordan had always liked this time of day. There was something peaceful about it, the world winding down into stillness. But peace, he had learned, could be deceptive. It happened quickly, almost too fast to register. A flash of headlights in his rearview mirror. A car speeding past him. Swerving violently. Jordan's hands tightened on the wheel as he instinctively slowed down, his eyes following the car's erratic movements. The sound came next, a sickening screech of tires. The crunch of metal as the car veered off the road, crashing through the guardrail. Jordan's heart jumped, the calm of the evening shattering around him. He pulled over, his truck coming to an abrupt stop on the shoulder. For a moment, he sat there, frozen. The smell of burnt rubber and gasoline drifted through the air, sharp and acrid. He could see the wreckage now. The car at the bottom of the embankment. Flames licking up from the hood. His breath caught. The scene was too familiar. Too close to memories he tried not to revisit. The fire, the twisted metal, it all came rushing back. For a fleeting second, he thought about driving away. About letting someone else handle it. But that thought dissolved as quickly as it had come. Someone was in that car. Someone needed help. Jordan shoved open the door of his truck, his legs carrying him toward the wreck before his mind could catch up. The embankment was steep, the ground uneven beneath his boots. The flames were growing, the heat pushing back against him as he reached the car. He could see a figure slumped over the steering wheel, motionless. "Hey," he called out, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "Can you hear me?" No response. The air around him was thick with smoke, stinging his eyes and throat. He reached the driver's side and tugged at the door handle. But it didn't budge. The metal was warped, jammed shut. He stepped back, assessing the situation. His hands were already moving, pulling off his jacket to wrap around his palms. The fire was dangerously close to the gas tank. He had seconds, maybe less. He braced himself and pulled on the handle with all his strength. The door groaned, resisting, but finally gave way, the sound of metal tearing like a scream in the night. Jordan leaned into the car, unfastening the seatbelt. That's when he saw the uniform, the unmistakable navy blue of a police officer. His heart sank. It was Officer Harper. Jordan froze for the briefest moment, the irony of the situation pressing against him like the heat of the flames. Of all people, it had to be Harper. The officer whose name had become synonymous with tension in the community. The man who represented a system Jordan had long learned to avoid. But there was no time to dwell on it. Harper wasn't just a symbol now, he was a man. Barely conscious, bleeding and broken. Jordan pulled him free, dragging him out of the car and away from the growing inferno. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming, and Jordan's leg throbbed with pain as he pushed himself to move faster. He was 20 feet away when the car exploded. A deafening roar followed by a wave of heat that knocked him to the ground. Harper's limp body landed beneath him, shielded from the worst of the blast. For a moment, there was only silence. The crackling of the fire seemed distant, muffled by the ringing in Jordan's ears. He pushed himself up, his muscles aching, and looked down at Harper. His face was pale, blood running from a gash on his forehead. But he was breathing. The wail of sirens broke through the quiet. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance, growing brighter as emergency vehicles approached. Jordan stood, his hands trembling as he wiped them on his jeans. The fire roared behind him, casting an eerie glow over the scene. He didn't wait for the paramedics or the questions that would inevitably follow. He gave them just enough information. "There's a man, still breathing. You need to help him before slipping away." Climbing back up the embankment toward his truck. His body ached with every step. But he didn't stop. He needed to get home, to find the stillness that had been ripped away from him tonight. As he drove off, the wreckage disappearing in his rearview mirror, he couldn't shake the image of Harper. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had saved the life of a man who might not have looked twice at him under different circumstances. A man who, in another moment, might have judged him on sight. Jordan didn't know what to make of it. He didn't know if it mattered. But deep down, he knew this night had changed something. And not just for Harper. The next morning, Jordan's phone started buzzing before the sun was fully up. He let it vibrate on the table, the persistent hum blending into the stillness of his kitchen. He stared at the coffee brewing on the counter, the rising steam like a ghost slipping through the quiet. He wasn't ready to answer questions. Wasn't ready to explain. What was there to explain? Anyway, he had seen someone in danger and acted. That was all. But in a town like his, news traveled fast. Even faster when it carried the scent of fire and heroism. By the time he opened the garage later that morning, word had already spread. Customers, neighbors, even people he barely knew stopped by to shake his hand. Their voices filled with gratitude and awe. Didn't know you had it in you, Jordan, one man said, grinning as he slapped Jordan on the back. Another leaned over the counter and added, saving a cop like that? You're a good man. Jordan nodded politely, offering a faint smile, but inside he felt the weight of their words pressing down on him. He didn't want to be anyone's hero. He just wanted to fix cars. To keep his head down and live in peace. The sudden attention felt like a spotlight he hadn't asked for and didn't know how to escape. The local paper had already run a story with the headline, Local Mechanic Rescues Officer in Fiery Crash. The photograph, snapped by someone at the scene, showed the remnants of the wreckage. The charred skeleton of the car stark against the night. Jordan's name was everywhere now, attached to something bigger than he had intended. He thought about Harper. The officer was still in the hospital, recovering from the crash and the injuries Jordan had pulled him out of. There had been no word from him. No acknowledgement. Not that Jordan expected any. He imagined Harper might even resent the fact that someone like him had been the one to save his life. The irony of it all hung in the air like a storm cloud. Unspoken but heavy. That afternoon, Jordan's sister Lisa called. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. I saw the article, she said, her voice steady but tinged with something he couldn't quite place. Yeah, Jordan replied, leaning against the workbench in his shop. You okay? Why wouldn't I be? Lisa sighed. Because this kind of attention, it's not just about what you did. You know how people around here think. They'll twist it into something else. Or expect you to be someone you're not. Jordan didn't answer. She wasn't wrong. You did a good thing, Jordan, Lisa continued, her tone softening. But I know you. This isn't what you wanted. I just did what anyone would do, he said finally, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. Not everyone would have done what he did, run toward the fire instead of away. Well, Lisa said, like it or not, people are looking at you differently now. You might as well figure out what to do with it. 2 days later, Jordan was under the hood of a pickup when he heard the bell on the garage door jingle. He wiped his hands on a rag and straightened, expecting a customer. Instead, he found Harper standing in the doorway. The officer's face was bruised, his left arm in a sling. He looked uneasy, his gaze flickering around the shop before finally settling on Jordan. Jordan, Harper began, his voice low and hoarse. I just wanted to thank you for what you did. Jordan nodded, his expression neutral. Did what needed to be done. I owe you my life, Harper said, stepping closer. His words were measured, careful, like he wasn't sure how they would land. I know we don't see eye to eye on everything, but I won't forget what you did for me. Jordan paused, the weight of Harper's words hanging between them. He didn't know what to say. There was no denying the significance of what had happened, but the unspoken history, the tensions that had always existed between them. Between their worlds still lingered. I'm glad you're okay, Jordan said finally, his tone even. Harper hesitated, then extended his uninjured hand. For a moment, Jordan stared at it. The gesture felt too simple for the complexities that surrounded them. But after a beat, he reached out and shook Harper's hand. The handshake was firm but brief. A bridge that felt tentative. Almost fragile. If you ever need anything, Harper said. I'm here. Jordan watched as the officer turned and walked out, the bell jingling faintly behind him. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. That night, as he sat at his kitchen table, the events of the past few days played over in his mind. He didn't know what to make of Harper's visit or the way the town seemed to view him now. There was a tension between the pride he felt in what he had done and the unease that came with being thrust into the spotlight. He thought about the divisions that ran through the town, the invisible lines that separated people like him from people like Harper. Those lines hadn't disappeared overnight just because he had pulled the man from a burning car. They were still there, deep and jagged, like scars that refused to fade. But something had shifted. He could feel it. even if he couldn't name it. As he stared out the window into the darkness, Jordan realized that the act of saving Harper hadn't just changed how people saw him. It had begun to change how he saw himself. The attention didn't fade as quickly as Jordan had hoped. In a town as small as his, stories like his rescue of Officer Harper had a way of lingering. Replayed in whispers over coffee at the diner or in the aisles of the grocery store. Some of the attention was kind, even warm, but it carried an edge of complexity that Jordan couldn't quite untangle. People saw him differently now, but not in ways that always felt comfortable. For some, he had become a symbol of courage, a man who had risked everything to save another. But for others, his actions seemed to raise questions they didn't know how to ask. Those glances, those small shifts in tone when he walked into a room, they hadn't disappeared. They had simply changed, reshaped by a single act that seemed to challenge the neat lines of how people thought the world worked. It was subtle, this divide. It wasn't something you could point to directly. But Jordan felt it, in the way people spoke to him, in what they left unsaid. The rescue had made him a kind of paradox. Someone who had done something undeniably heroic, but who still existed in the space between admiration and unease. At the garage, the flow of work remained steady. But even there, the atmosphere had shifted. A few customers who had always seemed distant now lingered a little longer, striking up conversations that felt tentative, as if they were trying to see him in a new light. Others avoided eye contact altogether, hurrying through transactions with the same guarded looks they'd always given him. One afternoon, a regular customer, a middle-aged man named Fred, stopped by to pick up his truck. Fred had always been friendly enough, the kind of guy who shook hands firmly and talked about the weather. But this time, as he handed Jordan the check, he hesitated. "Jordan," Fred said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, "what you did for Harper, that was something else. I mean, not everyone would have done that. You know?" Jordan didn't look up from the receipt he was writing. "Just did what needed to be done." Fred nodded, but his expression grew thoughtful. "Still," he said after a pause, "I bet some people in your community didn't like it much." The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. Jordan's hand paused, his pen hovering over the paper. He finished the receipt without responding and handed it to Fred. "Truck's running fine now," Jordan said, his tone even. Fred hesitated, as if waiting for Jordan to say more. But when it became clear that wasn't going to happen, he nodded and left. That evening, Jordan sat on his porch, the cool air of the approaching night wrapping around him. He thought about Fred's comment, about the unspoken assumptions behind it. He had seen the same sentiment in other faces, heard it in the edges of other conversations. People wanted to fit what he had done into a narrative they could understand, one that aligned with the divisions they had grown used to. Lisa called again that night. Her voice, as always, was steady but probing, nudging him toward truths he didn't always want to face. "I heard about Fred," she said after Jordan told her about the encounter. "Word travels fast," he replied, his tone dry. "It's not surprising," Lisa said. "You saved someone who's part of a system that hasn't exactly been kind to us. People are going to have opinions about that." "I didn't save a system," Jordan said, the edge in his voice surprising even himself. "I saved a person." Lisa was quiet for a moment, letting his words settle. "I know that," she said finally, "but not everyone sees it that way. And you can't control how they'll react." Jordan leaned back in his chair, staring out into the darkness. "I didn't do it for them," he said softly. "I didn't even do it for Harper. I just did it." "I know," Lisa said, her voice gentle now, "but you're in the middle of it anyway, whether you want to be or not." Over the next week, Jordan began to notice a shift in the conversations around him. It wasn't just the praise or the lingering looks, it was something deeper. People wanted him to speak out, to take a stand. They wanted him to explain what his actions meant, to define the line between heroism and the quiet divisions that still shaped their lives. The town was wrestling with itself, trying to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the story they couldn't ignore. Jordan wasn't sure where he fit in that struggle, or if he wanted to fit at all. Then came the invitation, a town meeting on community and policing, organized by a local church. The flyer had been slipped under the garage door one morning. Its edges slightly crumpled. At first, Jordan thought about ignoring it. He wasn't a speaker, and he didn't want to be. But Lisa's words lingered in his mind. You're in the middle of it anyway. The night of the meeting. He stood outside the church for a long time, his hands in his pockets. Before finally stepping inside, the room was full, the air thick with anticipation. People from all corners of the town were their neighbors. Business owners, officers. Harper was there too, his arm still in a sling. Jordan slipped into a seat near the back, intending to listen and nothing more. But as the conversation unfolded, as people stood to speak, some with anger, others with hope, he felt something stir inside him. When the moderator asked if anyone else wanted to share, Jordan surprised himself by standing. He walked to the front slowly, the weight of all those eyes pressing down on him. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice calm and measured. I'm not here to tell anyone what to think, he said. I don't have answers for the questions we're all asking. All I know is, that night, I didn't see a uniform or a history. I saw someone who needed help. And I helped. The room was silent, the tension palpable. But I also know, he continued, that what happened doesn't erase the things that divide us. It doesn't change the fact that some of us walk into a room and feel the weight of being judged before we say a word. It doesn't change the stories we carry, or the ones we tell ourselves about each other. He paused, letting his words settle. What it does change, he said finally, is what we do next. Whether we keep holding onto those divides, or whether we start finding ways to move past them. When he sat down, the applause was quiet at first, then grew louder, filling the room. But Jordan didn't feel pride. He felt something closer to relief, like he had finally spoken a truth he'd been holding for far too long. For better or worse, the lines in the town were shifting, and Jordan was starting to realize that he was part of that shift. Whether he wanted to be or not. The air was thick with a late autumn chill as Jordan stepped into the community center. He had driven past this building countless times, its plain brick facade blending into the fabric of the small town. Tonight, though, it seemed different, alive with a quiet urgency. Inside, the room was crowded but subdued. Folding chairs were arranged in uneven rows, and the faint hum of murmured conversations filled the space. On one side of the room, a group of older residents sat together, their hands clasped tightly in their laps. On the other, a handful of younger faces whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution. At the front of the room, the moderator, a middle-aged woman with a steady voice, stood beside a lectern. She was introducing the evening's agenda, a conversation about the strained relationship between the community and law enforcement. It was the kind of topic that most people avoided in public but couldn't stop talking about in private. Jordan had come intending to sit quietly in the back, to listen but not participate. He wasn't sure why he had even bothered showing up. Maybe it was Lisa's persistent encouragement. Or maybe it was the faint, nagging sense that this moment, this conversation was bigger than him. The first few speakers were hesitant, their voices careful as they navigated the unspoken boundaries of the room. A young woman described her fear when she saw police cars patrolling her neighborhood. An older man stood to defend the officers, recounting how they had helped him after his home was broken into. Each story seemed to edge closer to something raw, something unresolved. But no one quite touched it directly. Then Harper stood up. The room shifted at once, the tension becoming palpable. His sling was gone, though his movements were still stiff. He cleared his throat and glanced around the room before speaking. I know I'm not always seen in the best light, Harper began, his voice low but steady. I've heard the stories people tell about me. Some of them are fair, others aren't. But I'm here tonight because something happened a few weeks ago that made me see things differently. His gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on Jordan, who looked away. Jordan saved my life, Harper continued, and that's not something I can forget or take lightly. But more than that, it made me think about what it means to really see each other not as enemies, but as people. There was a murmur in the room, faint but audible. Harper hesitated, then added, I'm not saying everything's perfect now, or that one act erases what's come before. But it's a start, and I'm willing to keep trying. If you all are. When he sat down, The room was quiet. Jordan didn't know what possessed him to stand. His legs moved before his mind had caught up, carrying him toward the front of the room. He felt every eye on him, the weight of their expectations pressing against him like a tide. He paused at the lectern, his hands gripping the edges. "I didn't come here tonight to speak," he began, his voice even but soft. "I came to listen. And what I've heard is a lot of people trying to make sense of something that's been broken for a long time." He glanced around the room, meeting a few eyes before continuing. "I don't have a solution," he said. "I'm not a leader or an expert. I'm just a man who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. That night, when I saw Harper in that car, I didn't think about anything but getting him out. It didn't matter who he was or what uniform he wore. All I saw was someone who needed help." The room remained silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. "But the truth is," Jordan added, his voice tightening slightly, "we don't live in a world where it's that simple. Do we? We live in a world where what we look like, where we're from, and what we've been through shapes how we see each other and how we're seen. That doesn't go away just because of one act, no matter how big or small." He paused, letting the moment stretch. "I don't know what comes next," he said finally, "but I do know that nothing will change if we don't start seeing each other as more than just stories we've been told. We have to see the whole person, not just the parts we think we already know." Jordan stepped back from the lectern, the silence in the room stretching long enough to make him wonder if he'd said the wrong thing. Then, slowly, a round of applause began. It wasn't loud or exuberant, it was thoughtful, restrained. The kind of applause that suggested people weren't just agreeing with him but wrestling with what his words meant. After the meeting, a few people approached Jordan as he made his way toward the door. Some offered quiet thanks, others just a nod of acknowledgement. He noticed Harper lingering near the back, but their eyes didn't meet. As Jordan stepped out into the cool night air, he felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity. Speaking had taken something out of him, but it had also given him something in return, a sense that he was no longer just a bystander in his own life. The divisions in the town weren't gone. He knew that much, but for the first time, he felt like he had taken a step towards something better. And maybe, just maybe, the town had too. The mornings came slower now, colder as autumn leaned into winter. Jordan found himself waking earlier than usual, staring at the ceiling before finally dragging himself out of bed. His thoughts had been restless since the town meeting, swirling in ways he wasn't used to. The quiet predictability of his life seemed to be slipping through his fingers, replaced by something he couldn't yet define. At the garage, the work remained steady, the hum of engines, the clang of tools. It was the same rhythm he had known for years. But even here, the air felt different. Customers lingered longer, their conversations edged with something unsaid. Some offered praise for his words at the meeting, their voices quiet, almost reverent. Others seemed cautious, their usual politeness stretched thin, as if they didn't quite know how to navigate this new version of Jordan. He didn't blame them, he was still figuring it out himself. A week after the meeting, an invitation arrived in the mail. The envelope was plain, the kind you'd find in any office supply store. But the letter inside carried a weight that surprised him. The town council was forming a community advisory board. It said, aimed at improving relationships between residents and the police department. The board would include local leaders, business owners, and officers, and they wanted Jordan to join. He stared at the letter for a long time, the words blurring as his mind wrestled with the implications. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't an activist or a politician. He was just a mechanic. A man who had done one thing on one night and happened to be noticed for it. But as much as he wanted to dismiss the idea, something about it lingered. Lisa's voice echoed in his mind. Sometimes life puts us in places we didn't plan to be. He folded the letter carefully and set it aside. The first meeting of the advisory board was held in the community center, the same room where Jordan had spoken just weeks before. He arrived early, hoping to slip into a seat unnoticed. But the space was already filling with people. Harper was there, along with several other officers Jordan recognized but didn't know by name. On the other side of the room sat residents from various parts of town, shop owners, teachers, retirees. The moderator, The same woman who had led the town meeting. Called for everyone to take their seats. Her voice was calm, her demeanor steady, but Jordan could feel the tension in the room. The early discussions were careful. Almost painfully so. People spoke in measured tones. Their words circling around the deeper issues without quite touching them. The officers talked about the challenges they faced on the job, the dangers and the split-second decisions. The residents shared their frustrations, the feeling of being watched, of being treated as suspects rather than neighbors. When it was Jordan's turn to speak, he hesitated, his hands resting on the table. "I'm not here to pick sides," he said finally. His voice was quiet but firm, cutting through the uneasy murmurs. "I'm here because I know what it feels like to stand in the middle of something bigger than you. And I think most of us in this room have felt that at some point. Whether you're wearing a badge or not." The room was silent as he continued. "What happened the night of the crash didn't solve anything," he said. "It didn't erase the lines that have been drawn in this town for generations. But it made me think about what we're missing when we only see each other through those lines." His words hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortably honest. The weeks that followed were anything but easy. The board met regularly, each session a mix of progress and setbacks. The conversations were often fraught, emotions bubbling just beneath the surface. There were moments of anger, when old wounds were reopened, and moments of silence, when no one knew what to say. But there were also moments of connection, small, fleeting, but real. One evening, after a particularly tense discussion, Harper approached Jordan in the parking lot. The air was cold, their breath visible in the fading light. "Jordan," Harper began, his voice hesitant, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the meeting. About seeing the whole person. I guess I've spent a lot of years looking at things in black and white. It's easier that way, but easier doesn't mean right." Jordan studied him for a moment. The lines of tension in Harper's face softened by something that looked like genuine remorse. "It's not just you," Jordan said finally. "We've all got things we don't want to see. But maybe that's why we're here, to start looking." Harper nodded, and for the first time, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a bridge. At the garage, Jordan found himself surrounded by a different kind of attention. A group of kids had started hanging around, their curiosity drawn by his reputation. They asked questions about the cars, but it was clear they wanted more than just mechanical answers. One afternoon, as he showed a boy how to replace a spark plug, Jordan realized something. These kids were watching him, not just for what he did, but for who he was. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "fixing cars isn't just about replacing parts. It's about figuring out what's broken and how to make it work again. Sometimes, it's not easy, but it's worth it." The boy nodded, his eyes wide with understanding. Jordan stood there for a moment, the sounds of the garage fading into the background. He had spent so long trying to avoid being seen, trying to stay in the background. But now, he was beginning to see that maybe being visible wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe, he thought, this was how you start to build something new, not by erasing the past, but by finding ways to move forward, one small step at a time. The days were growing shorter, the light fading earlier as winter crept in. The cold seemed sharper this year, the kind that settled into your bones and stayed there. Jordan didn't mind the chill, though. It made the warmth of the garage, with its constant hum of activity, feel more like a haven. The group of kids who had started hanging around his shop were becoming a regular presence. They were young, 12, maybe 13, full of the kind of restless energy that came with having too many questions and not enough places to find answers. Jordan had started giving them small tasks, teaching them how to hold a wrench properly, how to listen to an engine to tell what was wrong. It wasn't just about the cars. He could see that, for these kids, it was about feeling seen, about having someone treat them like they mattered. One afternoon, Jordan was showing a boy named Malik how to check the oil in an old pickup when he noticed Harper standing just outside the shop. The officer looked out of place in his uniform, the hard lines of his duty belt contrasting with the soft sounds of the shop. Jordan nodded toward the kids. "Busy day?" Harper stepped closer, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Seems like it." He hesitated, then added, "I wanted to talk to you." Jordan wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the workbench. I've been thinking about the board meetings. Harper began. And about what you said. About seeing the whole person. It's not something I'm good at. I'll admit that, but I want to try. Jordan studied him for a moment. There was something in Harper's tone and openness that felt new. It's not easy, Jordan said. None of this is, but trying counts for something. Harper nodded, glancing at the kids. You're making a difference here. You know, with them. Jordan shrugged. I'm just fixing cars, teaching them what I know. It's more than that, Harper said. They see you. They see what you've done. Who you are. That matters. Later that week, the Community Advisory Board met again. The discussions had grown more productive over time, though the tensions still simmered beneath the surface. Jordan had come to expect those moments of discomfort, the pauses when words faltered. When someone's anger or pain spilled out despite their best efforts to keep it in check. But there were also moments of clarity. Like the time an older woman, a lifelong resident of the town, shared how her view of the police had been shaped by a single bad encounter decades ago. Or when a young officer admitted how hard it was to unlearn the assumptions he'd been taught. At this meeting, Harper spoke again. I've been part of this town for a long time, he said, and I've always thought I was doing my job the right way, keeping the peace, enforcing the law. But lately, I've realized that keeping the peace doesn't mean much if half the town doesn't trust you. That's on me, and it's on us. The room was quiet, the weight of his words sinking in. Jordan didn't speak that night. He didn't need to. The conversation was shifting, slowly but surely, and for once, it didn't feel like the weight of progress was resting entirely on his shoulders. The next morning, Jordan found Malik and a few other kids waiting outside the shop. They weren't there for cars this time. They had a question. Mr. Jordan, Malik said, his voice tentative. What made you do it? Save that cop. I mean? Jordan paused, the question hanging in the cold air. I didn't think about it like that. He said finally. I just saw someone who needed help. But he's a cop, another boy said, frowning. And they don't treat us fair. Jordan crouched down so he was at eye level with them. That's true, he said softly. There are things that aren't fair. Things that need to change. But if we only see each other for what's wrong, we'll never fix what's broken. The boys nodded, their expressions thoughtful. As the weeks went on, Jordan found himself more involved in the town than he ever expected to be. He joined the Community Advisory Board's subcommittee on youth programs, working to create spaces where kids could feel safe and heard. He started partnering with local schools, teaching basic auto repair as part of an after-school program. It wasn't grand work. It wasn't the kind of thing that would make headlines or change the world overnight. But it was steady, and it mattered. One day, as he walked into the garage, he saw Malik and a few other kids huddled around an engine. Their faces lit with excitement. Jordan smiled, a quiet sense of pride warming him against the chill of the day. The divides in the town weren't gone. The lines that had shaped their lives for so long were still there. Faint but present, but they were starting to blur. And for the first time in a long time, Jordan felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. Something worth building. Something worth staying for. Winter settled fully over the town, bringing with it frost-covered mornings and the sharp bite of wind in the evenings. The streets seemed quieter, muffled by the cold, and the rhythms of life slowed. But within the community, something else was stirring, a sense of cautious hope. Like the first hint of spring hidden beneath the snow. Jordan stood in the corner of the town hall, hands tucked into his pockets. As the room filled with people, it was a modest gathering. An event organized by the Community Advisory Board to recognize the progress made over the past months. A few police officers were scattered among the crowd, mingling with residents in a way that felt less forced than it might have just a year ago. At the front of the room, the mayor was speaking. His words were measured, his tone earnest as he thanked the board and the town for their efforts to bridge the gaps that had long divided them. But when he mentioned Jordan's name, calling him to the front, Jordan felt a familiar weight settle over him. He hadn't wanted to be the center of attention tonight. In fact, he hadn't planned to speak at all. But as the applause rippled through the room, slow and deliberate, he knew he couldn't remain in the shadows forever. Jordan walked to the podium, the murmurs quieting as he adjusted the microphone. He looked out over the crowd, faces he had known for years. And others he barely recognized. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, his voice steady but soft. "And I'm not here because I think I've done something extraordinary. I'm here because this town, it's my home. And like any home, it's got its cracks and its broken parts. But I believe it's worth fixing." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "When I pulled Harper out of that car, I wasn't thinking about who he was or what he represented. I was thinking about what needed to be done in that moment. Since then, I've realized that moment didn't just change his life, it changed mine too." Jordan's voice grew quieter, but it carried through the room like a steady heartbeat. "We can't undo the past," he said. "We can't erase the things that have divided us. But we can decide what to do next. We can decide whether we let those divisions keep defining us or whether we start seeing each other for who we really are." The room was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy with understanding. After the event, as people filed out into the cold night, a small group of kids lingered near the back of the room. Malik was among them, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his breath visible in the frosty air. "You did good, Mr. Jordan," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Jordan smiled, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thanks, kid. You doing okay?" Malik nodded. "Yeah, and I was thinking maybe when I'm older, I could have a shop like this. Teach people the way you do." Jordan's chest tightened at the boy's words, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the room's heaters. "You can do anything you set your mind to," he said, "but remember, it's not just about fixing cars. It's about fixing what's broken out there." He gestured toward the town square visible through the window. Malik nodded again, his eyes thoughtful. The following morning, Jordan was back at the garage, the familiar hum of the space grounding him. The kids were there too, working on an old engine he had pulled from a scrapyard. They laughed and talked, their voices filling the shop with a liveliness that made the cold day feel warmer. For the first time in a long time, Jordan felt at peace. The journey he had started months ago, the one he hadn't chosen but had embraced nonetheless, had brought him here. The divides in the town weren't gone. They wouldn't disappear overnight, or even in his lifetime. But they were starting to blur, to soften at the edges. And as Jordan looked out at the kids, the next generation, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It didn't come with applause or headlines. But it was there, steady and real. The kind of hope that made you believe change was possible, not all at once, but one small step at a time.